The image people remember from Blackbeard's death may not come from the fight at all. It comes from a book printed 6 years later. The closer source is plainer. On December 17, 1718, Lieutenant Robert Maynard wrote from North Carolina. His letter did not give Edward Teach a speech. It did not stage a monster. It counted men, guns, wounds, prisoners, and the narrow water where two small vessels closed around a pirate sloop. The case is how that happened. The question is not whether Edward Teach died at Ocracoke. The contemporary record is strong on that. The question is how a 10-minute boarding fight became the image most people still carry. The answer begins before the boarding. In the last weeks of 1718, Virginia's governor, Alexander Spotswood, decided that a pirate operating from North Carolina was no longer only North Carolina's problem. Teach had been using the inlets behind the Outer Banks as a shelter. Ocracoke was not an open harbor in the way a Navy officer would prefer. It was shoal water, shifting channels, and local knowledge. A large warship could not simply sail in and solve the problem. The water protected the man being hunted. That geography shaped the attack. Spotswood sent 2 hired sloops from the Pearl and the Lime, and he put Lieutenant Robert Maynard in command. Maynard was not sent in a ship of the line. He went in small craft that could cross the bar and work inside the inlet. The map matters here. If this fight had happened in deep water, Maynard's larger naval world would have mattered more. At Ocracoke, depth mattered. A vessel that drew too much water was a liability. A vessel that could slide into the shallows had a chance. By November 22nd, Maynard had found Teach near Ocracoke. The closest source does not give a clean cinematic wide shot. It gives pieces. 2 sloops, a pirate vessel aground or constrained in shoal water, a first exchange of fire, men hidden below decks. Then a boarding action so close that the outcome turned on who was still standing when the smoke cleared. This is where the case usually leaves the record and enters performance. But Maynard's account does something colder. He describes a tactical problem. Maynard had 2 sloops and 54 men. He says he had no mounted guns to answer Teach in the same way, only small arms and pistols. Teach's sloop had mounted guns. In that water, the difference mattered. The first exchange damaged Maynard's force before the real boarding began. Mr. Hyde, commanding the smaller sloop, was killed. Men were wounded. That vessel fell astern. Maynard's own sloop had to keep moving toward a better armed enemy with less support than the attack plan required. This is the scene the later legend often skips because tactics are harder to remember than costume. Maynard needed Teach to misread the deck, so he thinned it. He ordered men below. From Teach's side, the sloop now looked beaten or nearly emptied. The visible deck promised an easy finish. The hidden deck held the answer. Teach boarded into that mistake. Men came over the side. Then Maynard's men rose from below, not as an image, but as a tactic. The fight became close enough for broken blades, cuts, and men falling where they stood. The lieutenant and Teach met in the crush. Maynard's sword broke. One of Maynard's men cut Teach. The contemporary accounts differ in emphasis, but not in the basic shape. After the brief boarding fight, Teach fell, and his remaining men were taken or killed. The numbers are rough because the sources are not all written for the same purpose. Maynard's letter gives one version of the casualties and prisoners. Spotswood's official correspondence gives another official view of the expedition in the aftermath. A Boston newspaper carried contemporary reports for readers in New England. None of those sources turns the death into a Gothic stage. That absence is the episode. The source package for this case has 4 layers. First, Maynard's December 1718 letter, the closest account of the fight. Second, Spotswood's official correspondence, the governor's version of the expedition and aftermath. Third, contemporary newspaper reporting, including reports that show how quickly news could travel and distort. Fourth, Johnson's 1724 General History of the Pirates, the book that made the death readable as legend. Johnson is not useless. That would be too easy. He preserves stories, names, narrative shapes, and sometimes details that overlap with contemporary records. But overlap is not identity. When Johnson gives a detail that the earlier sources do not carry, the script has to call it what it is, Johnson's version. The fight at Ocracoke is a clean test because each layer had a reason to speak. Maynard had reason to report what happened. Spotswood had reason to defend the expedition. The newspapers had reason to print news of a famous pirate killed. If the dramatic details later attached to Teach's death had been central to the naval report, this is where we would expect at least one contemporary source to say so. They do not. Before the last fight, Teach's position had already changed. He was not at the height of a career built only on force. He had accepted a pardon in North Carolina, settled into a political gray zone, and continued to move in a world where pirate, trader, pilot, and colonial official could touch the same transaction. The Queen Anne's Revenge, the large vessel most associated with him, had already been run aground near Beaufort Inlet months before. The material record of that wreck is still being conserved and studied in North Carolina. The archaeology does not prove how Teach died. It does something narrower and more useful. It pulls the story away from costume and back toward logistics, cargo, armament, navigation, repair, and the use of shallow coastal routes. The legend tries to make the man explain the system. The records make the system explain the man. Ocracoke was not a duel in an empty sea. It sat inside colonial rivalry, local shelter, shallow water geography, and a governor willing to cross jurisdictional lines. Spotswood's correspondence is full of the problem that piracy created for government. Not a single villain, but a zone where law, trade, and local complicity stopped lining up cleanly. Maynard's letter is valuable because it refuses the later theatrical grammar. It does not need Teach to look supernatural. It needs the Board of Admiralty, the governor, and the public to understand that the operation was difficult, costly, and successful. Maynard was explaining a decision under pressure. He took small craft because the inlet required them. He hid men below because the enemy's first fire had put him at a disadvantage. He let Teach misread the deck because the fight could not be won by matching broadside to broadside. He turned a weakness into a trap. Johnson's Blackbeard is unforgettable because he is built like an image. The account gives him a staged appearance, pistols, smoke, menace, and a final fight with the rhythm of a printed legend. The details are vivid. They are also late. They come from Johnson's 1724 history, not from Maynard's letter, Spotswood's official correspondence, or the contemporary newspaper reports. This detail comes from Johnson's 1724 account. In the contemporary sources used for this episode, I found no confirmation for the theatrical additions Johnson made famous. That is the source anatomy. The page that made the image is not the page closest to the fight. The split is not small. Maynard's version is a report about a boarding action. Johnson's version is a portrait. Maynard names tactical conditions. Johnson builds character. Maynard gives the fight as a matter of positioning, surprise, and casualties. Johnson makes the body carry the meaning. That does not mean every Johnson detail is automatically false. It means Johnson cannot be allowed to enter the script under the name of the record. When he is the source, he has to be named. Hold the case as two columns. On one side, November 22, 1718, Ocracoke Inlet, Maynard's small vessels. Teach's sloop, a first blast of small shot. Men ordered below, a boarding fight of roughly 10 minutes. Teach dead, survivors taken. On the other side, 1724, a London narrative, the theatrical body, the staged terror. The death scene shaped so strongly that later retellings copied the image even when they did not read the sources behind it. The sources closest to the fight were not written to preserve atmosphere. Maynard was accounting for an action. Spotswood was defending a policy. The newspapers were transmitting news. Each source has its own bias. Maynard had every reason to show that he acted bravely and effectively. Spotswood had every reason to justify sending Virginia forces into a North Carolina problem. Newspapers could compress, garble, and amplify, but all three share a limit. They do not give Johnson's full theater. That shared limit has weight. The midpoint of this case is not the moment Teach falls. It is the moment we notice which source won. The official sources won the event. Johnson won the memory. That is why the common version is so hard to dislodge. The late version is easier to see. A tactical report asks the viewer to hold geography, vessel type, chain of command, and timing in mind. A Gothic portrait gives the viewer one image and asks them to remember it. Memory chose the image. The Queen Anne's revenge archaeology pulls in the other direction. Since the wreck site was discovered in 1996, the project has treated the vessel as a material problem. Identify the wreck, conserve the artifacts, map the assemblage, study the guns and hull remains, and test the attribution carefully. Archaeology is not a replacement for Maynard's letter. It is a check on the kind of story Johnson encouraged. The wreck asks material questions. What kind of vessel was this? How was it armed? How did it sit in the water? What cargo and fittings survived? Those questions move the story from appearance to infrastructure. For a pirate operating along the Carolina coast, infrastructure is not background. It is the case. Teach's advantage had depended on the same things that made Ocracoke hard for Maynard: local pilots, shallow draft, inlets, political shelter, and the ability to move between legality and threat. The death at Ocracoke happened when that advantage failed. Maynard brought vessels small enough to enter the space. He used a tactical deception simple enough to survive in a letter. Then the fight moved onto the deck and ended quickly. The record does not require a supernatural enemy to make that dangerous. It was dangerous already. There were men killed on both sides. Men wounded, men taken prisoner and later brought into the colonial justice system. Teach's head was cut off and displayed, a state act meant to turn the dead pirate into proof that the governor's operation had worked. That is violent enough without borrowing Johnson's theater. The aftermath also shows why the official record matters. Spotswood did not only report a fight, he moved against networks. He wrote about suspected collaborators and the goods connected to Teach's activity. The expedition was not merely a death scene, it was a colonial government trying to cut the local supports that let piracy function near the inlets. That is why the prisoners matter too. The surviving men were not stage furniture for a famous death. They were the part of the case the government could still process. Dead men could be displayed. Living men could be questioned, tried, named, and used to expose who had bought goods, who had given shelter, and who had treated Teach as a local business risk rather than a public enemy. Maynard's letter moves quickly from fight to accounting because that was the work left after the deck went quiet. How many were killed? How many were taken? Which vessel was secured? Which goods could be traced? A pirate death became useful to government only when it could be turned into documents. Johnson's later version works in the opposite direction. It turns the documents back into a body. It takes a fight that produced prisoners, correspondence, claims, and jurisdictional argument, and compresses it into one man made visible enough to outlive the paperwork. That compression is the trick. This is where the popular story flattens the case. If the episode is only a death image, then the answer is personality. If the episode follows the sources, the answer is a chain. Shallow water, local shelter, Virginia intervention, small vessel tactics, boarding, execution of authority, then printed legend. That chain is more specific than the myth and less tidy. Maynard does not emerge from it as a flawless hero. His report is still a report written by the officer who survived and needed the action understood in a particular way. Spotswood's letters are still political documents. The Boston newspaper reports are still newspapers. Contemporary does not mean neutral, but contemporary means close. Close matters. Johnson's distance matters too. 6 years is not ancient history, but it is long enough for an event to be shaped for readers who wanted a moral spectacle. Johnson's book did exactly that across pirate history. It gave pirates theatrical death scenes, sharpened speeches, and memorable moral shapes. The book's power was not that it invented everything. Its power was that it selected, arranged, and intensified. For Teach, the intensification became the man. That is why the title of this episode belongs to the letter. The source closest to the fight is the better anchor. It does not give us everything. It gives us enough to know when the later story has crossed the line from record into literature. The best reconstruction of November 22, 1718 is therefore restrained. At first light, 2 small vessels work inside the inlet. Teach's sloop lies near enough to be engaged. There is gunfire. Maynard's force suffers. Maynard hides men below. Teach boards into what he thinks is a weakened enemy. Hidden men rise. The fight becomes hand-to-hand. Teach falls. The survivors are secured. The state takes the head as evidence. That sequence is not dull. It is simply not the legend. The contemporary sources point to something harder to film and easier to believe. Piracy worked where geography, trade, local politics, and reputation gave it room. Edward Teach died when that room closed. Visual reconstructions are AI-assisted and based on historical records. The final irony is that Johnson's version did not erase Maynard. It used the same death to make a better printed figure. Maynard won the deck. Spotswood won the policy claim. Johnson won the afterlife. In the contemporary sources used for this episode, I found no confirmation for Johnson's theatrical additions to the death scene. What I do find is a lieutenant's report about a short, costly boarding fight in shoal water, backed by a governor's correspondence and contemporary newspaper reporting. That is not a smaller story, it is a sharper one. Blackbeard's death did not become famous because the record was clear. It became famous because the record left space for a writer to dress the body after the fight. Maynard's letter gives us the death as an action. Johnson gives us the death as an image. The gap between them is where Blackbeard became Blackbeard.